Most people believe one thing without question, that your family will never be the ones to destroy you. But what if the people who promised to protect you, to love you unconditionally, were the very ones who quietly unraveled every part of your life? Tonight, this isn't a story about strangers on the street or hidden enemies in the shadows. This is a story about a woman named Emily, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary capacity to trust, and how the very people she called family betrayed her in ways that shattered her world forever. Emily gave everything, her heart, her dreams, even her future, to the people she believed cared for her. What she didn't see coming was that the smiles around her dinner table hid deception, greed, and a calculated endgame that would leave her life in ruins. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. When Emily vanished, there were no broken windows, no signs of struggle, no frantic phone calls in the middle of the night. One day she was there, living her quiet, ordinary life, and the next day she was simply gone. The police were told it was nothing unusual, that she had chosen to step away, that she needed space to clear her head. Her own family stood together and repeated the same story with calm faces and steady voices. They said Emily had always been sensitive, that she had talked about starting over, that this disappearance was her decision alone. And at first, the story made sense. Adults leave. Families argue. People disappear into new lives all the time. But beneath those carefully chosen words was a truth that no one outside that family could see yet, because someone was lying, and the lie was being protected by the people who should have been searching for her the hardest. To the neighbors, Emily's home looked the same as it always had. The lights went off at night, the mail stopped piling up, the yard stayed neat. Nothing screamed emergency. Her family made sure of that. They answered questions before they were even asked, presenting a version of events that sounded reasonable enough to close doors and quiet suspicion. Friends who called were told Emily was taking time away. Coworkers were told she had moved on to something new. Each explanation was delivered with just enough concern to sound believable, but not enough urgency to trigger alarm. And slowly, the world around Emily adjusted to her absence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the silence grew heavier. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from something being carefully buried. What made this disappearance different wasn't what was missing, but what was present. There were no desperate pleas from her family to find her. No public appeals. No reward posters. No pressure on law enforcement to dig deeper. Instead, there was patience, almost acceptance. And that was the first quiet signal that something was wrong. Because families who lose someone they love don't usually move on so quickly. They don't close ranks and control the story with such precision. Yet Emily's family did exactly that. They spoke for her when she couldn't speak for herself. They defined her choices, her state of mind, her future, all without her there to confirm any of it. And the more time passed, the more that version of Emily became the only one people remembered. So the questions begin to form, slowly at first, then all at once. Why would Emily walk away from everything without telling a single person she trusted outside her family? Why would a woman so connected to her routines, her work, and her plans suddenly erase herself without leaving a trace? And why were the people closest to her so certain she didn't want to be found? These questions didn't come from the police at first. They came from the gaps in the story, from the small inconsistencies that only become visible when you stop accepting the surface explanation. Because when a lie is repeated often enough, it doesn't crack loudly. It wears thin quietly. Emily's life, before she disappeared, wasn't marked by chaos. There were no public breakdowns, no dramatic exits, no warning signs that she was preparing to vanish. She paid her bills. She showed up where she was expected. She talked about the future in ordinary ways, the way people do when they believe they have one. That's what made the idea of a voluntary disappearance so convenient and so dangerous. It allowed everyone to stop looking. It allowed the truth to stay exactly where it was. And the truth wasn't hidden in some distant place or secret location. It wasn't locked away in a stranger's house or buried in paperwork. The truth lived inside the family that claimed to love her. As the months passed, details that once seemed unimportant began to feel heavier. Emily's phone activity stopped abruptly. Her bank accounts showed movements that didn't match the idea of someone starting a new life. Personal belongings remained untouched, as if she had stepped out for a moment and never returned. When these details were raised, her family had explanations ready. She must have left things behind on purpose. She must have trusted someone else to handle her finances. She must have wanted a clean break. Each answer sounded plausible on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that felt rehearsed. And patterns like that don't happen by accident. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore the central mystery. Why did Emily's own family turn against her when she trusted them the most? What were they protecting so fiercely that they were willing to let the world believe she had abandoned her life? And how long did the truth remain buried under carefully chosen words, polite smiles, and a shared agreement to say nothing more than necessary? These aren't questions that explode into the open. They sit quietly, waiting for someone to ask them out loud. Waiting for someone to notice that the evidence wasn't missing at all. It just wasn't where anyone thought to look. Because the real story of what happened to Emily was never written in police reports or missing person flyers. It was written in family conversations that never included her. In decisions made behind closed doors. In benefits gained from her absence and freedoms created by her silence. This wasn't a mystery built on chaos. It was built on control. And for a long time that control worked. The lie held. The story stayed intact. And Emily, the woman at the center of it all, remained a name spoken in the past tense, while the people who knew the truth continued living as if nothing had ever happened. Emily was the kind of woman most people recognized immediately because there was nothing theatrical about her life. She worked steadily, showed up on time, and believed that responsibility was a form of love. She believed in doing things the right way not because anyone was watching, but because that was how she was raised. Family mattered to her deeply, not as an idea, but as a daily practice. She called when she said she would. She showed up for birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sundays that didn't make it into photographs. She trusted authority figures, trusted systems, trusted that if you followed the rules, things would eventually work out. To people who knew her, Emily felt familiar. She was someone you could depend on. Someone who believed that loyalty was permanent, that blood meant protection, and that the people who shared your name would never be the ones to harm you. From the outside, Emily's life looked calm, even predictable, and that was exactly how she liked it. She believed stability was something you built slowly, brick by brick, through consistency and effort. She didn't chase chaos or drama. She avoided conflict whenever she could, often choosing peace over being right. That trait, the very thing that made her easy to trust, also made her easy to overlook. Emily rarely demanded attention. She assumed that being reliable was enough. And for a long time it seemed like it was. Her family praised her dedication, her willingness to help, her sense of duty. They relied on her, leaned on her, and quietly came to expect that she would always be there, filling the gaps, solving problems, and keeping things together without complaint. Family gatherings were important to Emily, even when they were uncomfortable. She noticed the small moments others brushed aside. The way conversations stopped when she entered a room. The jokes that landed just a little too sharply. The comments about money, responsibility, and gratitude that seemed harmless on the surface but lingered longer than they should have. When decisions were made, they were often framed as collective choices, but Emily felt the weight of them more than anyone else. She told herself this was normal. Families weren't perfect. Love came with friction, and she believed that endurance was part of belonging. She believed that if she just stayed patient, stayed loyal, things would balance out in the end. As time went on, subtle tensions began to shape the rhythm of her life. Financial discussions became more frequent, and they were rarely straightforward. Money was never presented as a shared resource, but as a tool for influence. Emily contributed more than she took, and when questions arose, she was reminded of everything the family had done for her. Support came with strings attached, though they were never named outright. Decisions about her future were discussed as if they belonged to everyone but her. And still, Emily trusted. She believed that compromise was love in action. She believed that family knew best. She believed that disagreement didn't mean danger. Emily's parents, Robert and Linda, were respected in their community. They were the kind of people others described as solid, dependable, and traditional. They valued order and appearances, and they taught their children that reputation mattered. What people saw on the surface was important, sometimes more important than what happened behind closed doors. Emily absorbed these lessons early. She learned to keep problems private, to present strength even when things felt uncertain. Her younger brother, Michael, followed a different path, one that allowed him more freedom and fewer expectations. Emily noticed the difference, but she didn't challenge it. She assumed roles were assigned for a reason. She assumed fairness wasn't always equal. As Emily grew older, the balance of power within the family became clearer. Conversations about inheritance, property, and long-term planning happened without her full involvement, even when they directly affected her. When she asked questions, she was told not to worry, that everything was being handled. "Trust us," they said. "Family takes care of family." Emotional pressure replaced open discussion. Disagreement was reframed as ingratitude. Silence was praised as maturity. And slowly, Emily learned that love in her family came with expectations that were never written down but always enforced. To outsiders, the family looked close. Holidays were spent together. Photos were taken, smiles carefully arranged. Friends saw unity, tradition, and support. What they didn't see was how control operated quietly, without raised voices or obvious conflict. Decisions were guided, not forced. Choices were narrowed, not denied. Emily wasn't told no outright. She was made to feel that certain paths simply weren't right for her. That independence was risky. That loyalty required sacrifice. And because Emily valued harmony, she accepted these limits as the cost of belonging. What looked like love from the outside was control on the inside. It was control dressed as concern, guidance framed as protection. Emily was encouraged to depend on the family while being subtly discouraged from building too much independence beyond it. Her trust was rewarded with approval when she complied and distance when she didn't. Over time, she learned which version of herself was acceptable. She learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. And in doing so, she gave the family something powerful without realizing it. Access to her decisions, her resources, and eventually her silence. By the time everything began to break, the foundation had already been weakened. Emily didn't see herself as trapped. She saw herself as loyal. She didn't see manipulation. She saw an obligation. She believed that family bonds were unbreakable, even when they strained under pressure. She believed that love meant endurance, that trust meant surrendering doubt. And because of that belief, she never imagined that the greatest threat to her life wouldn't come from strangers or chance, but from the people she trusted most. The day everything changed didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It came quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as just another family conversation. Emily woke up that morning believing she was walking into a discussion that could still be fixed. She had spent the night rehearsing her words, telling herself that honesty would finally clear the tension that had been building for months. She believed that if she explained how she felt, if she spoke calmly and respectfully, her family would listen. That belief was rooted in years of loyalty, years of choosing patience over conflict. What Emily didn't know was that this conversation wasn't a discussion at all. It was a decision that had already been made without her. The argument began the way most family conflicts do, with practical concerns framed as care. Robert spoke about responsibility. Linda spoke about what was best for everyone. Michael stayed mostly quiet, watching, stepping in only when needed. Emily tried to explain that she wanted more control over her own finances, her own decisions, her own future. She wasn't asking for permission, only understanding. But the more she spoke, the more the room seemed to close in on her. Her words were met with pauses that felt heavy, followed by statements that redirected the conversation back to obligation and loyalty. She was reminded of everything the family had done for her. She was told she was being emotional, that she didn't see the bigger picture. From the family's perspective, this was a concern. Later, they would say Emily was agitated, confused, overwhelmed. They would say she was pushing people away, refusing help, making choices that didn't make sense. They would describe the conversation as tense but ordinary, a disagreement that ended without resolution. To them, it was the moment they realized Emily needed space, that she wasn't thinking clearly, that stepping back was the best thing for her. That was the story they would repeat, calmly and consistently, every time the question came up. But Emily's friends remember something different. They remember her reaching out in the days leading up to that conversation, uncertain but hopeful. She spoke about feeling controlled, about feeling like her life was being managed without her consent. She didn't sound reckless. She sounded tired. She talked about wanting peace, not escape. She talked about resolving things, not running from them. Friends would later say she had plans, obligations, things she was looking forward to. She didn't sound like someone preparing to disappear. She sounded like someone trying to hold on to her life. As the argument reached its peak, Emily realized she wasn't being heard. Every attempt to assert herself was reframed as defiance. Every question was met with a reminder of consequences. The space between sentences grew longer. Silence settled in, thick and uncomfortable. It was in that silence that Emily understood something had shifted. The balance she had trusted for so long was gone. The family unity she believed in was conditional, and she had crossed an invisible line. She stood up, not dramatically, but with the quiet resolve of someone who knows they've said all they can say. She left the room believing time would cool things down, believing distance would bring clarity. That was the last day anyone outside the family ever saw her. What happened next is defined not by action, but by narrative. Emily didn't return calls. Messages went unanswered. At first, this wasn't alarming. She had been upset before. She had taken time to herself. But days passed and concern grew. Friends reached out to the family, asking if they had heard from her. That's when the story began to form. Emily needed space. Emily wanted to be alone. Emily had decided to step away and start fresh. Each version of the explanation carried the same core message. This was her choice. The family controlled the flow of information carefully. They spoke before others could ask. They framed concern as interference. They positioned themselves as the only ones who truly understood Emily's state of mind. When police were notified, the explanation fit neatly into existing assumptions. An adult woman, no signs of struggle, a family insisting she left voluntarily. There was no immediate evidence to contradict that claim. No forced entry, no abandoned cars, no dramatic scene to demand urgency. The report was taken, notes were made, and the case was quietly categorized as a voluntary absence. The lie didn't sound like a lie because it wasn't told with panic. It was told with certainty. The family spoke as if they were protecting Emily's privacy, not erasing her. They emphasized her independence, her sensitivity, her need for time. They asked for patience. And patience is often the enemy of truth. As days turned into weeks, the absence normalized. The lack of new information became its own explanation. If something terrible had happened, surely there would be signs. Surely someone would know. Surely the family wouldn't be so calm. Behind closed doors, life adjusted. Emily's belongings stayed where they were. Her responsibilities were quietly redistributed. Decisions she would have been part of were made without her. And every unanswered question was met with the same response. Emily chose this. Emily didn't want contact. Emily would reach out when she was ready. The repetition hardened the story into fact. It didn't need proof. It needed time. And time was exactly what it was given. For years, no one questioned it. Not loudly. Not officially. The story held because it was easier to accept than the alternative. Because challenging a family's account requires believing they could do something unthinkable. And most people don't want to believe that. So Emily became a quiet absence, a name that faded from conversation, a life reduced to an explanation that fit neatly into everyone else's comfort. And somewhere inside that silence, the truth remained untouched. waiting for someone to notice that a choice explained too well is often hiding something it doesn't want to reveal. After Emily vanished, the world did not stop. There were no headlines, no press conferences, no candlelight vigils on the evening news. Her absence slipped quietly into the background of everyday life, and that quiet became its own shield. Without public attention, there was no pressure, and without pressure, there was no urgency. The police file sat untouched for long stretches of time, revisited only to confirm that nothing new had been reported. Emily's family did not ask for interviews or plead for help. They did not organize searches or push for answers. Instead, they carried on with their routines, presenting calm acceptance as proof that nothing was wrong. Sometimes the most effective crime is one no one believes exists. And for a while, Emily's disappearance lived in that space, where silence does the work that force never could. As months passed, the family's version of events hardened into something that sounded final. Robert spoke of Emily as someone who needed distance. Linda described her as fragile and overwhelmed, and Michael echoed their words when asked. Each statement supported the next, forming a closed loop that left no room for doubt. Friends who pressed for more information were gently pushed away, told they were making things harder than they needed to be. Concern was reframed as interference. Questions were treated as disrespectful. Over time, people learned that asking about Emily led nowhere. And when questions stopped being asked, stories stopped being tested. The family's ability to move on became its own validation. If they weren't worried, why should anyone else be? But silence has a way of cracking when enough time passes. Small details that once seemed unimportant began to surface, not all at once, but gradually, through quiet observations and lingering unease. Emily's bank records showed activity that didn't align with someone starting a new life. Accounts were accessed, funds were moved, but there were no signs of rent, travel, or basic expenses that would suggest she was living independently somewhere else. Personal documents that would have been essential for a fresh start were still inside the family home. A neighbor mentioned seeing Emily's car days after she was supposedly gone, parked in the same spot, untouched. Each detail on its own could be dismissed. Together, they began to whisper a different story. The inconsistencies grew harder to ignore when timelines were compared. Robert recalled conversations that Emily's phone records didn't support. Linda spoke about messages that were never sent. Michael described events that didn't align with known dates. These weren't dramatic contradictions, just subtle misalignments, the kind that slip through when a story is repeated too often without scrutiny. A close friend of Emily's, someone who knew her habits and routines, noticed that the explanations didn't fit the woman she knew. Emily wouldn't leave without closing certain chapters. She wouldn't abandon responsibilities she had always taken seriously. That friend didn't accuse anyone. She simply raised a concern. And that concern lingered. One detail didn't match, and it couldn't be explained away. Emily's signature appeared on a document dated after her disappearance, authorizing changes she had never discussed. When questioned, the family offered explanations that sounded reasonable but didn't hold up under closer examination. Stress, oversight, confusion. Yet the paper trail told a clearer story than words ever could. Someone had acted in Emily's name when she could not speak for herself. That single inconsistency reopened a door that had been quietly closed for years. It was enough to prompt a second look, enough to justify revisiting a case that had been allowed to rest. When detectives returned to Emily's file, they didn't find chaos. They found an order. Too much order. Statements were neat, consistent, and carefully aligned. But when replayed with new context, the same calm explanations felt rehearsed rather than reassuring. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline, placing phone records, financial activity, and witness accounts side by side. Gaps appeared where there shouldn't have been any. Pauses in communication that no one had questioned before suddenly felt deliberate. The idea of a voluntary disappearance grew weaker with every comparison. What once sounded like concern now sounded like coordination. As the investigation reopened, Robert and Linda were asked to repeat their statements. This time, the questions were slower, more precise. Dates were revisited. Words were examined. Michael was asked to clarify details he had previously glossed over. Each interview revealed the same thing: certainty without evidence, confidence without proof. The detectives weren't looking for emotion. They were looking for consistency under pressure. And pressure changes how stories behave. Minor discrepancies surfaced, not enough to accuse, but enough to doubt. Enough to suggest that the truth had been shaped, not remembered. Emily's disappearance was no longer treated as an absence. It was treated as an event. Investigators shifted their focus inward, examining the family's role not as witnesses, but as participants in the narrative that followed. The calm that once protected the story now worked against it. The lack of urgency, the controlled messaging, the financial movements all pointed in the same direction. This wasn't a case of a woman choosing to disappear. It was a case of a disappearance being explained away. And as detectives dug deeper, it became clear that the lie had held for so long not because it was strong, but because no one had dared to pull at it. Now that someone finally had, the truth was no longer as quiet as it once was. As investigators pushed deeper, the direction of the case began to shift in a way few people were prepared for. What started as a search for Emily slowly turned into an examination of the story told in her place. Every record, every decision made after her disappearance, led back to the same circle. The evidence did not point outward, pointed inward. Financial documents revealed transfers and authorizations that benefited Robert and Linda directly. Assets Emily had contributed to were redistributed. Responsibilities she once carried were reassigned without question. Control over accounts, property, and decisions quietly consolidated. The longer Emily remained absent, the simpler life became for the people who spoke for her. The people who reported her missing were the same people who benefited from her absence. At first, the motive didn't look dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was built on control, reputation, and access. Emily had been the reliable one, the stabilizing presence, the person who made things work without drawing attention. But she had also begun to push back. She wanted autonomy. She wanted clarity. She wanted a voice. To a family that valued order above all else, that shift represented risk. Questions threatened the structure they had built. Independence threatened control. And when loyalty becomes conditional, resistance becomes a problem that must be managed. Investigators began to see Emily's disappearance not as an emotional break, but as a solution. As detectives reconstructed the final days before Emily vanished, the family's calm explanations took on a different tone. Statements once described as caring now felt strategic. The insistence that Emily needed space began to sound like a boundary placed around the truth. Every delay worked in the family's favor. Every unanswered question created distance. The absence of urgency wasn't oversight. It was designed. When detectives asked why no missing person alerts were pushed, why no public appeals were made, the answers circled back to privacy and respect. But privacy can also be a way to keep others out. And respect can be a way to silence inquiry. The financial trail became impossible to ignore. Signatures appeared where Emily could not have signed. Decisions were made on her behalf without legal clarity. Funds were accessed in ways that contradicted the idea of a woman starting over somewhere else. When confronted with these facts, Robert's explanations shifted. Dates blurred. Details changed. Linda grew quieter, offering fewer words, relying on Robert to speak. Michael, once confident, began to hesitate, correcting himself mid-sentence, adjusting timelines. The unity that once made their story strong now revealed its weakness. The same phrases repeated too often, the same explanations delivered too smoothly. The pressure mounted quietly. There were no dramatic accusations at first, only questions that refused to go away. Investigators laid out timelines, placing calls next to transactions, statements next to documents. The picture that formed was slow but clear. Emily's absence wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was useful, preserved control. It protected reputation. It prevented conflict from spilling beyond the family's walls. The truth had been delayed, not destroyed, and delay had allowed it to harden into something that felt untouchable, until it wasn't. When arrests finally came, they did not arrive with chaos. They arrived with weight. Robert was the first to be confronted with the full scope of the evidence. He denied wrongdoing, insisting that everything he did was to protect his daughter, to respect her wishes. Linda said little, her silence heavy, her gaze fixed downward. Michael maintained distance, repeating that he only followed instructions, that he trusted his parents. The language of family loyalty was still being used, even as the ground beneath it collapsed. The courtroom became the first place where the story could no longer be controlled. As details were presented publicly, the image of a voluntary disappearance unraveled. Financial benefit was established. Control was documented. The narrative the family had protected for years was dismantled piece by piece, not through emotion, but through fact. Friends of Emily listened in disbelief as the truth emerged, realizing how close they had been to it all along. The family sat together, not united, but bound by what they could no longer deny. Denial lingered in small gestures, in tightened jaws and folded arms, but it could not erase what had been exposed. The emotional peak did not come from shouting or tears. It came from recognition. From the moment it became undeniable that Emily's trust had been used against her, that the people she relied on most had chosen preservation of their world over her right to her own. Silence filled the room where explanations once lived. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A family that once spoke with one voice now had nothing left to say. And in that silence, the weight of what they had done settled fully into place, leaving behind a truth that could no longer be buried, no matter how long it had been hidden. In the end, the truth about what happened to Emily did come out, but not in the way most people imagine justice should. There was no single moment where everything felt balanced again. No clean conclusion that made the years of silence feel repaired. Evidence had been delayed too long. Records were incomplete. Critical moments existed only in memory, softened by time and denial. What remained was enough to establish responsibility, but not enough to fully restore what had been taken. The outcome satisfied the law in part, but it did not satisfy the weight of what was lost. For those who followed the case closely, it felt like justice arrived late, and when it finally did, it arrived quietly. Robert faced consequences, but not the full measure many expected. The case leaned heavily on documentation and circumstantial proof, and while the pattern of control and benefit was clear, parts of the truth had faded beyond recovery. Linda's role was acknowledged in ways that felt incomplete, framed by silence and the limits of what could be proven. Michael, positioned between loyalty and responsibility, became a symbol of how obedience can shield wrongdoing without directly committing it. The family structure that once appeared unbreakable fractured under scrutiny, but the legal outcomes reflected compromise rather than closure. Some sentences were reduced. Some charges were never filed. And Emily's voice, the one that mattered most, remained absent from the room. For those who believed the truth would bring relief, the aftermath was sobering. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, there was a realization that systems designed to protect people often rely on timing, visibility, and pressure. Emily had none of those when she disappeared. Her case was quiet, controlled, and deliberately framed to avoid attention. By the time questions were taken seriously, years had passed. Memories softened, details blurred. The truth was still there, but parts of it had slipped beyond reach. What survived was enough to expose betrayal, but not enough to undo it. Emily's story forced an uncomfortable reflection, especially for those who understood the weight of family obligation and authority. This wasn't just a crime. It was a failure of trust, of institutions, and of family. Trust failed when loyalty was used as leverage instead of protection. Institutions failed when calm explanations were accepted without challenge. Family failed when control was mistaken for care and silence was chosen over honesty. Emily believed, as many do, that family was the safest place to stand. That belief shaped every decision she made, right up until the moment it was used against her. The people who loved Emily were left with questions that had no satisfying answers. Could anything have been done sooner? Would things have changed if someone had pushed harder, asked louder questions, refused to accept the easy explanation? The truth is uncomfortable because it suggests how easily a life can be rewritten when the right voices speak at the right time. Emily's disappearance didn't rely on force or chaos. It relied on trust, on the assumption that family would never be the ones to cause harm, on the belief that love and control are always separate things. In the years that followed, Emily's name returned to conversations, no longer as a mystery, but as a reminder that quiet cases deserve loud questions, that calm explanation should still be tested, that authority, especially within families, should not be immune from scrutiny. Her story did not end with resolution in the traditional sense. It ended with awareness, with a truth that, while incomplete, could no longer be denied. And sometimes, that is all that remains when time has taken everything else. The opening belief still echoes through the story, unchanged and challenged all at once. Most people believe one thing without question, that your family will never be the ones to destroy you. Emily believed that. She lived by it. And because of it, she trusted without defense, without suspicion, without a backup plan. Her life became a cautionary reminder not about fear, but about balance. About understanding that trust should not require surrender, and loyalty should never demand silence. As this story comes to a close, one question remains, heavy and unresolved, lingering longer than any verdict ever could. If the people closest to you decided to betray you, would anyone believe it? As Emily's story settles, it doesn't end with certainty or comfort. It ends with reflection, the kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Her life, her trust, and the silence that surrounded her disappearance raise questions that don't belong only to this case. They belong to anyone who has ever believed that loyalty guarantees safety, that family always means protection. Emily believed that, and because she did, the warning signs were easy to explain away, easy to excuse, easy to ignore. That is what makes her story difficult, not because it is rare, but because it is familiar in ways we don't like to admit. Do you think justice was truly served, knowing that parts of the truth were lost to time, softened by delay, and filtered through systems that depend on urgency to work? Would you have seen the warning signs if you were standing where Emily stood, surrounded by people you trusted, being told that concern was love and control was care? These are not questions with simple answers, and that's why they matter. Stories like this don't ask for outrage. They ask for honesty, about how easily we accept explanations that feel comfortable, and how rarely we question silence when it comes from the people closest to us. If Emily's story made you pause, if it made you reconsider how trust works inside families, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what you think really mattered most in this case. Was it the delay, the control, or the way authority was never challenged until it was too late? Your perspective adds to the conversation, and conversations like this are how stories like Emily's stop being repeated in silence. And as this chapter closes, another story is already waiting. Next week, we'll be telling the story of a man who vanished for 20 years, and the wife who knew exactly where he was the entire time. A story about absence, deception, and the cost of knowing the truth while pretending you don't. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe for real stories where the truth refuses to stay buried.